The wind howled through the towering pines, a mournful, hollow scream that seemed to carry the voice of the wilderness itself. The snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the earth in a thick, merciless sheet of white. The sky, a dull, leaden gray, pressed down with the weight of an impending storm. Garrett Monroe's breath escaped in jagged clouds, the frigid air cutting through his throat like glass. His footsteps crunched against the frozen earth, each step a battle against the knee-deep drifts that clung to his legs, numbing his calves through his insulated gear. The wilderness was ruthless tonight, and every instinct in his body told him to turn back, to seek shelter, warmth, and safety. But something in the air stopped him cold. A sound. No, a plea. It came low and guttural, barely rising above the storm's fury. Garrett froze, his pulse quickening. The wind carried the sound again, raw, fractured, and full of pain. His gloved hand tightened around his walking stick as he strained his ears, unsure if the wind was playing tricks on him. But no, it came again. Not a growl, not a warning, a call, a cry. His chest tightened with an unfamiliar dread. A lifetime spent exploring the wilderness taught him to trust his instincts, and everything in his body screamed that something, someone, was suffering. He turned his head toward the sound, his eyes squinting against the blinding curtain of snow. His boots dragged forward before his mind could argue otherwise. Branches whipped against his shoulders as he pushed through the dense pines, their limbs heavy with ice. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but the cry, the plea, grew louder, desperate, fragile. It was the sound of life on the edge of death. He felt it in his bones. Then, through the storm's choking haze, he saw them. A massive shape, a bear, her towering form hunched and trembling, her once powerful frame battered by the cold. Steam billowed from her nostrils in labored bursts as she shielded two small, frail cubs pressed against her side. Their tiny bodies convulsed from the cold, their fur matted with ice. The mother's breathing was shallow, ragged, her strength draining with every frozen gasp. Garrett's heart plummeted. Bears shouldn't be awake. Not in this. Hibernation was their shield from the brutal cold, but something had gone terribly wrong. Suddenly, the mother bear lifted her head, and her dark eyes locked with his. Garrett felt the breath leave his body. There was no rage, no wild fury in that gaze. Only exhaustion, only desperation. His pulse thundered, and his instincts screamed conflicting orders. Stay back. She's a bear. She could kill you in a heartbeat. But his body refused to move. He stood frozen, not from the cold, but from the raw, unspoken plea in her eyes. The wind wailed between them, but the silence inside Garrett was deafening. The bear shifted weakly, her massive body trembling from the effort, and revealed her cubs fully. The little ones, barely alive, their tiny sides heaving with shallow, erratic breaths. Their eyes, glassy and distant, fluttered as the snow crusted on their delicate lashes. One of them gave a faint, heart-wrenching whimper, so small, so fragile, that it shattered something inside him. Then, the mother did something that would haunt him forever. With a tremor-racked paw, she pushed at the snow, nudging one of the cubs forward, toward him. Her body sagged from the effort, her strength nearly gone. And still, her gaze never left his. She wasn't warning him. She wasn't threatening him. She was offering, trusting him with the one thing she lived for. Garrett felt his throat close as a surge of emotion threatened to drown him. Every survival instinct screamed at him to leave, but the voice in his heart, the human, mortal part of him, roared louder. Help them. His body moved before his brain caught up. He sank to his knees in the snow, the cold burning through his layers, and reached out, slowly, trembling. The little cub's breath was faint against his palm, its tiny chest fluttering like a dying ember. He felt its fragile warmth, so fleeting, and something deep and primal inside him cracked wide open. But the second cub, Garrett's stomach lurched. It wasn't moving. His heart raced. "No, no, no," he whispered, barely aware of his own voice. His trembling fingers brushed the little body. Cold, too cold, and panic surged. He cradled it close to his chest, his own warmth spilling into the tiny form. Behind him, a heavy breath. Garrett's body tensed, his spine stiff as he felt the looming shadow of the mother bear. His muscles screamed to flee, but he couldn't move. His arms tightened around the cub instinctively, a silent vow he didn't fully understand. If she decided to end him here, he wouldn't resist. But she didn't strike. Instead, he felt a nudge, soft, weak, against his arm. The bear's massive nose, pressing gently against her cub in his grasp. Garrett's eyes stung with freezing tears, his breath hitching. She was begging, pleading, trusting him to save them. The wind howled like a chorus of anguish around them, the wilderness a frozen cathedral to their fragile, shared moment. He had never felt so small, so powerless, yet so profoundly connected. His voice broke as he whispered, "I'll try. I swear I'll try." Above them, the blizzard raged mercilessly, indifferent to their battle against death. Garrett felt the frost clawing at his skin, felt his body screaming from the cold, but his grip on the cub only tightened. He had no idea how he would save them, no plan, no tools, only the searing, impossible need to act. Yet, deep down, he knew. The storm wasn't their greatest enemy. Time was. And it was running out. If you think this was intense, what happens next will defy every survival instinct Garrett has ever known. The world felt impossibly still, despite the howling wind that tore through the trees and screamed past Garrett Monroe's ears. The blizzard raged, but within this fragile pocket of frozen earth, time seemed to hold its breath. His pulse thundered in his chest, a frantic rhythm against the oppressive silence. He was kneeling in the snow, the trembling form of the tiny cub pressed against his chest, its weak heartbeat barely a flutter against his ribs. Each shallow breath from the creature felt like a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, precious, fleeting, and slipping away far too quickly. But the air between him and the mother bear was heavier than the storm. She stood only feet away, her massive frame heaving from exhaustion, her fur frozen in jagged clumps of ice. Her eyes, deep, black pools, locked onto his, and within them burned something raw and primal. Fear, desperation, and something more, an unspoken question. Garrett's throat felt tight, his voice frozen along with the air in his lungs. He felt the primal warning in his bones. He was inches from death. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, and the beast's survival instincts could rip him apart in a heartbeat. But the moment between them defied instinct. It was fragile, delicate, like the thin ice over a deadly river. And in that fragile space, something sacred passed between man and beast. A plea and a promise. Garrett's voice, when it came, was hoarse and cracked. "I'm here. I." The wind swallowed his words, but he knew they were not for the bear's ears. They were for her heart. His gloved hand, trembling and slow, shifted slightly, adjusting the cub cradled against him. A soft whimper escaped the little creature's throat, barely audible above the storm. But the mother heard. The change in her was immediate. A low rumble, not a growl, but a sound from the deepest part of her being. A mother's voice, ancient and universal. She took a single step forward, and Garrett's entire body screamed to flee. But his soul anchored him where he knelt. She lowered her great head, her breath, hot despite the cold, vapor twisting into the night. Her nose, wet and trembling, brushed the air between them. Garrett felt his chest constrict, his instincts battling his humanity. Every nerve screamed danger, but his heart ached with something far more profound. He had seen many things in his years wandering the wilderness: birth, survival, and death. But he had never seen a wild creature ask for anything. And she was asking. The second cub, smaller, frilier, let out a weak, broken sound, a whisper of life on the edge of slipping away. The mother's massive paw shifted in the snow, trembling as she pressed it toward him, and Garrett felt a crack deep inside his chest. The bear wasn't protecting her cubs from him. She was offering them to him. His throat burned as he swallowed down the wave of emotion rising within him. His voice, barely audible, escaped through trembling lips. "I'll help them." The promise tasted like iron on his tongue, binding and sacred. The bear's eyes never left his. And then, slowly, painfully, she lowered herself into the snow. Her colossal frame, built for power, for protection, folded into the earth with the grace of something ancient, something that understood that strength wasn't in force alone. It was in trust, in surrender. Garrett felt his body quake, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of the moment. His fingers, numb and stiff, found the emergency thermal pack inside his coat. He cracked it hard, and within seconds, heat began to radiate. Carefully, he pressed it against the second cub, whose fragile body was barely more than a trembling breath. "Come on, little one," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't give up." The mother's massive head shifted, her eyes narrowing on his hands. She could tear him apart in a single swipe. Instead, her paw, powerful enough to crush bone, moved, gently, impossibly gently, nudging his wrist closer to the cub, as if urging him. Save them. His eyes stung with freezing tears. "I'll save them," he rasped, his voice cracking under the weight of it. "But you have to let me." For a breathless second, he didn't know if she understood. Then, with a shuddering exhale, the mother shifted. Her bulk, weakened but still formidable, pressed into the snow beside him. She curled her massive body, not to block him, but to shield him from the raging wind, enclosing them all in a fragile, desperate shelter. Garrett's heart felt like it would burst. He worked quickly, his hands clumsy, his body stiff with cold. He pressed the second cub into his coat, sealing in whatever warmth his body could offer. His breath was labored, burning with frost, but he did not stop. His fingers, blue and raw, cracked as he rubbed warmth back into their tiny, frozen paws. "Stay with me," he begged through chattering teeth. "Don't go, not now." The first cub twitched, its body trembling against his chest. A sob, raw and unfiltered, escaped him. "That's it," he choked, his voice breaking. "That's it, little one. Fight." The mother bear, her body heaving, pressed her face close. Her breath warmed the space between them, and Garrett felt something ancient, something sacred, pass between them. But he knew the truth. This wasn't enough. The storm was winning. Their fragile shelter would be their grave if he didn't act. The abandoned ranger station, less than a mile, if he could make it. But the bear, would she let him leave with her cubs? Would she follow, or would her instincts drive her to protect them here, where they would surely die? Garrett's body screamed for relief, but his heart thundered with something more powerful, the unbearable weight of a choice he could not afford to get wrong. The mother's eyes met his, dark, primal, and knowing. She understood, and without words, they made their choice together. But if Garrett thought the blizzard was his greatest enemy, he hadn't met what lay beyond the trees, and time was already running out. The wind roared like a living beast, its icy claws slashing through the trees and lashing against Garrett Monroe's already battered body. The snow, driven by the gale, stung his face like shards of glass, seeping into every gap of his clothing until the cold felt like it was gnawing at his bones. His vision narrowed into a white tunnel, the blizzard blinding him to everything but the fragile lives he held against his chest. 2 cubs, their tiny bodies barely clinging to warmth. His legs burned with exhaustion, every step through the waist-deep snow a war against his failing strength. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale a cloud of vapor torn away by the wind before it could linger. He felt the tremors in his limbs, not from the cold alone, but from the relentless fight against it. His body screamed for him to stop, to collapse, to surrender. But the faint, rhythmic flutter of the cub's breaths against his chest kept him moving. The mother bear was close behind, He could hear her labored steps crunching through the snow, a colossal shadow in his periphery. She staggered with every stride, her strength fading, yet her gaze never wavered from him or her offspring. She trusted him, an unspoken pact forged in the heart of the storm. But the blizzard was not a witness to mercy. A sudden gust slammed into Garrett with monstrous force, sending him sprawling into the snow. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and for a horrifying moment, he lost his grip on the cubs. No, his voice, raw and cracked, was swallowed by the storm. He scrambled, his gloved hands clawing through the snow. The first cub, there. He pulled the trembling body close, feeling its fragile heartbeat. Desperation fueled his search for the second, and then, relief, searing and sharp. The second cub, half buried, its tiny chest still moving. The mother bear, her body heaving with exertion, lowered her head and nudged the second cub toward him with a gentleness that did not belong to a creature of her size and power. It was an offering, a plea. Garrett's throat closed with emotion as he gathered both cubs back into his jacket, pressing them against his chest where his body's failing warmth might keep them alive a little longer. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I won't let you go." But the storm wasn't finished with them. A deafening crack, sharp and terrifying, split the air. Garrett's heart seized as he saw it. A towering pine, weakened under the weight of ice and snow, splintering from its core. "Move!" His voice was instinct, not thought. He lunged, his body screaming as he rolled with the cubs clutched tightly to his chest. The tree collapsed in a thunderous crash, missing them by mere inches, the impact sending a shockwave through the ground. Splinters of wood and ice sprayed through the air, slicing at his exposed skin. Pain flared along his side, a sharp, burning agony. He gasped, his vision flickering with the edges of darkness. He didn't need a look to know he was hurt, but there was no time for pain. Only the cubs mattered. The mother bear, battered and bleeding from the tree's splintered limbs, pushed herself back to her feet. She shook, her body swaying, her massive form broken but unbowed. Her eyes found his. Despite her wounds, she stepped forward, placing herself between him and the wind. Garrett's chest heaved, his throat tightening with something beyond exhaustion, beyond pain. It was awe. This creature, this mother, was giving everything to protect him and her young, not with teeth and claws, but with her body, her trust, her life. Tears burned hot against his frozen cheeks. "You're still fighting," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper over the wind. "So I will, too." His battered body screamed protest as he forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling and weak. The cubs, so impossibly small and fragile, stirred against his chest. The warmth of their faint breaths against his skin was both a lifeline and a dagger of urgency. The ranger station, safety, warmth, life, was still beyond the wall of white, but it could have been on another continent for how distant it felt. Garrett's hands trembled as he pulled his jacket tighter around the cubs. His lips, cracked and numb, barely formed the words. "We're getting there. I promise you. We're getting there." The mother bear gave a low, pained huff beside him, and with agonizing slowness, she began to move again. Every step she took was a testament to her breaking body and unbreakable heart. Garrett moved with her, step for step, man and beast defying the storm together. His breath was a jagged rasp, his legs near collapse, but he could not stop. Then, his foot sank into something that wasn't solid. The ground, gone. A sickening crack, and Garrett was falling. The world twisted into chaos as he crashed through brittle ice into a pocket of frozen earth. His body struck hard, the impact jarring every bone. He gasped, but the wind was gone, only suffocating, frozen air, and the weight of snow above him. The cubs, were they? A tiny movement against his chest. A weak, flickering warmth. Alive. Still alive. Panic screamed in his chest as he realized he was trapped, buried, Snow pressed against his face, seeping through his clothes. His body's last heat draining into the void. Above, faintly, he heard it. Scratching. A heavy, labored sound. The mother bear. She was digging. His shattered body could barely process the miracle of it. The beast he had feared. The predator. Now his lifeline. He felt the vibrations as her claws tore through the snow and ice. Felt the tremors as she carved toward him with a mother's desperation. Darkness licked at the edges of his vision. He was fading. But as the cold pulled him under, he felt it. Something warm brushing his frozen hand. Her nose. She had reached him. A final whisper escaped his cracked lips. "Don't stop." The world slipped into black. But the storm was far from done with them. And the greatest test of survival had not yet begun. The darkness was heavy, thick, absolute, and cold. Garrett Monroe felt the world crushing him, the weight of ice and snow pressing down on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. His body was numb, but his heart still pounded, a frantic, rhythmic defiance against the silence of the frozen grave that had swallowed him whole. The faint warmth against his chest was the only thing keeping him anchored. The fragile, trembling bodies of the cubs pressed close to his heart. Their breaths, shallow and weak, ghosted against his skin, each exhale a fragile whisper that screamed, "Don't let us go." But Garrett's body was failing. His fingers, blue and stiff, barely responded as he tried to claw upward, his nails scraping uselessly against compacted ice. His head swam, his thoughts fracturing under the rising tide of hypothermia. And in the crushing silence, the cold spoke, the voice of surrender, seductive and sweet. "You've done enough. You fought. Rest now. Let be over." But through the numbness, something else, faint but distinct, scratching, a heavy, desperate sound, and a warmth, so alien in this frozen tomb, a breath against his cheek. The bear, the mother bear, his vision, blurred and fading, caught the faintest glimpse, a darkness breaking the darkness, her muzzle, streaked with snow and blood, pushing through the collapse. Her great paw, trembling and raw from tearing through ice and stone, groping toward him. Garrett's lips cracked as they parted, and a sound, a whisper, a plea, escaped. "You found me." A sudden shift, light, pale, cold. But there, a gap opened above him as the bear tore free another chunk of ice, and air, blessed and sharp, rushed into his starving lungs. He coughed, his body convulsing from the shock of it, and the cubs stirred weakly at the sound. Then, a great warmth enveloped him. The bear's muzzle, rough and cold, pressed against his arm, and in that moment, Garrett felt it, an impossible, primal connection. She wasn't only digging for her cubs. She was digging for him. His voice cracked through frozen lips. "I'm here." The bear's head lifted, and their eyes met. His clouded with pain and cold, hers dark and burning with something raw and ancient. She stepped back, and the cave of snow cracked further, opening just enough for him to move. But his body refused. The cold had stolen his strength. His limbs, frozen and heavy, wouldn't obey. And as he felt the last threads of his will unraveling, the terror hit him. I can't save them. The cubs. The station. He was going to die here. And worse, he was going to fail them. A sound tore from him. Raw, broken, more than a sob, less than a scream. No. Then, movement. The ground shifted. Snow gave way beneath his broken form, and the heat, the massive, living heat of the mother bear pressed against him. She was pushing him, not attacking, not dragging, lifting him. With the last reserves of her strength, she pressed her bulk beneath his body, lifting his dead weight upward, driving him toward the surface. Garrett's head broke into the open air, and he gasped, a sharp, tearing breath that felt like fire. His vision burst with light and shadow, and he collapsed onto the snow, the cubs still cradled against him. His body heaved, lungs fighting for every inch of air. His eyes, wild and blurred, searched, and he saw her, the bear. She was down, her massive form half buried where she had forced him upward. Her sides barely rose, her chest heaving with effort and agony. Blood streaked her mouth from where she had bitten through ice and rocked to reach him. Her breath, a shuddering, fractured rhythm, spoke of limits reached. No, Garrett's voice cracked, the agony of it tearing from his chest. He pulled himself forward, his frozen hands digging into the snow as he crawled. Get up, you get up. His vision spun, but he reached her side, his hand pressing against the heaving fur. Her body trembled under his touch, trembled and stilled. Garrett's heart shattered. No, no, no. His hand gripped the fur tighter, his voice breaking into something helpless and wild. You can't. His breath caught in a sob, his forehead pressing against her. You can die now. You saved us. A tremor, a breath. The bear's eye, half-lidded, glazed with pain, opened. Her gaze met his, and in it, he saw something that brought his chest to ruin, acceptance. She had given everything, everything, and the only thing she asked of him was finish it. Garrett's throat burned. Don't. His voice cracked, shattered with grief. Don't you quit on me. A sound, a soft, impossibly gentle huff, and her head, so heavy, fell. Something broke inside him. Pain, raw, beyond anything the cold could ever bring, exploded in his chest. It was too much, too wrong. She had trusted him, given him everything. The cubs stirred, barely clinging to the edge of life. And something roared inside him. His fists clenched, his fingers curling into the snow. His head snapped up, and his eyes, wild burning, found the barely visible outline in the blizzard the station. It was still there, so close. His body screamed that it wouldn't go on. He was shattered, bleeding, broken. But the sound from his lips was not a cry of pain. It was a snarl, a promise. You want me to finish this? His voice was a whisper and a vow. His eyes, bloodshot and burning, turned back to her still form. Then I will. He bent low, pressing his palm one last time against her heaving side, his voice raw and shaking. I'll save them. His throat tightened. I swear it. Then he moved. Every step felt like agony, his body screaming for surrender. But something else had taken hold of him, a fire that burned hotter than any storm, forged in grief and bound by promise. The station was ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the rage of the blizzard. Behind him, nothing but silence. But if Garrett thought the storm had broken him, what waited inside would test his soul beyond anything he could imagine. The wind screamed as if the earth itself were in agony, and Garrett Monroe staggered beneath its fury. His body, battered and broken, felt more like a carcass dragging through the snow than a man. The blizzard hadn't relented for a second, and every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. His skin, raw and numb, had long since lost the ability to feel anything but the cruel burn of the cold. Yet, against all reason, he moved. The cubs, those fragile, flickering embers of life, remained pressed against his chest beneath his jacket. Their breaths, faint and erratic, were the only warmth left in his world. Garrett could no longer tell if the damp on his cheeks was melting frost, blood from wind-cracked skin, or the tears he refused to acknowledge. The mother bear, his fierce, improbable companion, was gone. Her body, spent and still, lay somewhere behind him, and the hollow ache of that loss felt like a blade through his ribs. She had trusted him with her children, trusted, and now every step forward was a pact, an oath paid in blood, breath, and bone. The ranger station was out there, a ghost of salvation hidden beyond the blizzard's rage. But each step felt like it pulled him deeper into a white abyss with no end. His legs buckled without warning, and he crashed hard into the snow. The cold leached into him immediately, a predator waiting for its prey to stop struggling. For a heartbeat, he lay still. The snow pressed over him, soft and suffocating, whispering of peace, of rest. It would be so easy, so quiet. But then, a whimper, so faint it was almost imaginary. The smallest cub shifted against his chest, its tiny head pressing into him with a weak, pleading nuzzle. The other was still, too still. Garrett's body convulsed with something hotter than fire, terror. The sound that ripped from his throat was raw, almost inhuman, as he surged upward with a strength he did not have. He tore the zipper down and cupped the cubs with trembling, ice-bitten hands. The second one limp, its breath a thread that was snapping. "No," he choked, his voice shaking and broken. "No, no, no." His hands, cracked and bloody, moved without thought, rubbing at the cub's tiny, frozen body. "Breathe." He pressed the cub closer to his chest, his own body heat barely warmer than death. His voice cracked, his lips bleeding from the cold as he begged, "Don't leave me. Don't." A twitch, the faintest flutter of life. And then, a shallow gasp. Garrett's chest shattered with a sob. "That's it," he whispered, his voice a wrecked whisper against the howling wind. "That's it, little one. Stay with me." But he felt it, how close they were to the edge. And the edge was closing fast. With a primal roar, Garrett moved. His legs screamed, his lungs tore, but he moved. The storm slammed against him, a monstrous hand trying to shove him back into the earth. His feet sank and slipped through the snow, but he pushed forward, dragged forward every step of war. The landscape around him had become a blank, monstrous canvas. No horizon, no sky, no direction, just white. His body had long surrendered to cold and pain. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel himself, but he could feel them. The tiny, fragile lives, each flicker of their breath, against his skin a countdown he couldn't bear to lose. A dark shape loomed suddenly through the white veil. His chest heaved with a ragged cry as he recognized it. The ranger station, a skeletal structure of wood and steel, half buried in snow, its windows frosted over and dark. The door, just there, only a few yards, but his body, hollowed and drained, failed. His knees struck hard, and the ground swallowed him. His arms locked around the cubs, protecting them even as his body collapsed into the frozen earth. He clawed forward, his voice lost in the storm's throat, but his body would not rise. The station's door, only feet away, might as well have been on the moon. "No," he rasped, barely audible. His cracked lips pressed against the cubs' heads, their warmth fading. His heart shattered under the weight of a truth he could not bear. "I got you this far, but not far enough." The darkness crept from the edges of his vision. The world, white and screaming, began to dim, and with it the last fragile beat of his strength. But then, a sound. The storm changed. The wind, deafening and wild, suddenly fractured, pushed aside by something larger, something massive. Through the curtain of snow, a shape, a form from the storm's womb, primal and immense. Not the mother, another. The colossal figure, fur bristling with ice, a towering shadow of raw power, emerged from the white void. A great bear, a male, its eyes burning with something ancient and knowing. The beast's head lowered, nostrils flaring as it scented the air, the cubs. Garrett's body stiffened with the last pulse of instinct. His arm curled tighter around the cubs, his lips cracking as he formed the shape of a single, impossible word. "Don't." The bear's eyes, predator dark, fixed on him, and time, frozen, endless, held. Then, the bear moved, not to strike, to help. The earth trembled beneath its massive paws as it crossed the space between them. The heat of its breath, thick and heavy, melted frost from Garrett's face as it lowered its colossal head. Then, gently, impossibly, its muzzle nudged beneath Garrett's shoulder. A push. Garrett, half dead, felt his body shift forward. The station steps closer. The bear, with a strength beyond reason, pushed him again. And Garrett, with the last flicker of life, reached. His numb fingers found the splintered wood of the door. A shove. His shoulder hit the entrance. The door groaned and gave. Garrett collapsed inside, the heatless air of the station still salvation. The cubs, his shaking, broken hands placed them on the frozen floor. And then, darkness claimed him. But this was not the end, because outside the door, in the howl of the blizzard, the bear stood watch, and what Garrett would awaken to would change everything. A silence thicker than the storm engulfed the room. Not the peaceful kind, but the hollow, aching kind that waits between heartbeats. The silence of something slipping away. The wind screamed outside, its rage muffled by the station's battered walls. But inside, the battle was far more terrifying. A war fought between life and the cold hand of death. Garrett Monroe lay sprawled on the frozen floor, his body a broken vessel, stripped of warmth, stripped of strength. His breath, when it came, was shallow, ragged, and uneven. His chest barely lifted beneath his torn jacket, and frost glazed his beard in a cruel mockery of life. His fingers, cracked and blue, remained half-curled around the two fragile lives he had carried through hell itself. The cubs, so small, so impossibly still, lay on the icy floor, their tiny bodies barely rising with each desperate breath. Their fur, stiff with frost, barely twitched as cold tried to steal the last remnants of warmth from their veins. Garrett's eyes, half open and glassy, flicked to them with what little life he had left. His lips, cracked and colorless, parted in a whisper, a sound no louder than the air leaving his lungs. Stay, his voice fractured, a plea to the universe, to the cold, to anything listening. Stay with me. But death was already in the room. It was in the cold seeping through the floor, in the shadows gathering behind his eyes. It was in the way his body refused to move, in the slow collapse of his chest that felt too quiet, too final. It was in the cubs' stillness, the way their tiny sides fluttered less and less, as if something unseen were pulling them away, breath by breath. A tremor, small and weak, rolled through Garrett's broken body. Not from the cold, but from something deeper, from fear. Not for himself, for them. The mother bear's sacrifice, her body, her trust, could not end here. Not in this silent room. Not with their lives slipping between his fingers like grains of sand. Garrett's throat closed with a sound that was part sob, part rage. No, he choked, his voice raw and jagged. No, his fingers twitched, cracked nails scraping against the icy floor as he tried to move, to crawl, to fight. But his body was a cage of agony, his limbs frozen anchors. Tears burned his eyes, hot, furious tears that had nothing to do with the cold. You. His voice broke as he stared at the cubs, their breath barely there. You don't get to leave. Not after everything. Not here. His body screamed as he moved, his muscles locking, his chest burning. But his hand, numb and clumsy, found his pack, half frozen and torn. His fingers closed around the emergency flare. The shaking in his limbs turned violent, his vision splintering into shadows and stars. His thumb struggled against the frozen cap. Crack. Snap. The safety gave, and the flare sparked, angry and red, a slash of fire against the cold. The sudden heat scorched his hand, but he didn't care. He rolled, with agony screaming through every tendon, and shoved the flare toward the cubs, toward their frozen, fragile bodies. The flare's light, raw and searing, threw shadows against the walls, casting the room in the color of war. The heat, faint but real, licked against the cub's fur. Garrett's voice broke from his chest, raw and shattered. Breathe. A cough, so tiny, so fragile, escaped from one of them. A twitch. The faintest shudder. Garrett's heart nearly cracked from the force of it. Yes, he rasped, his voice a ruin. "Come on, fight." The other cubs stirred, barely, a faint gasp, a flicker of movement in the shadows. But the flare, his only warmth, was burning too fast. Dying, the red glow dimming. Garrett's chest seized with something worse than cold, helplessness. It wasn't enough. His body, already on the edge of collapse, trembled violently. His fingers scraped uselessly against the ice, too weak to rise, too empty to give them more. And in that moment, something inside him broke. A sound escaped him, low, guttural, and primal. A sob so raw it carried his soul with it. "Take me." His voice, desperate and shattered, hit the frozen air like a plea to something unseen. "Take my warmth, my life. Just save them." The flare sputtered, choking on its last ember. The cubs lay still, and then a new warmth. Not from the flare, from above. A shadow, a massive, towering form, stepped through the shattered doorway. The bear, the male, the giant who had pushed him to the door. But he was not here for Garrett. His massive eyes, dark and knowing, locked on the cubs. The beast moved. Power and grace compressed into something ancient and unfathomable. His breath, hot and heavy, rolled from his jaws, and his body, colossal and wild, lowered. With a sound that was neither growl nor roar, but something deep and low, something pure, the bear pressed his massive body down around them, not crushing, not taking, sheltering. The heat of his colossal form, his breath, his life, wrapped the cubs in a warmth that the storm could not steal. Garrett, barely clinging to consciousness, felt it, the shift in the air, the flare's light dying, but hope burning brighter. The smallest cub, a breath, stronger, more certain. The second, a twitch, a soft sound, a heartbeat returning. Garrett's vision blurred, his body surrendering. But his lips, cracked and bleeding, formed the faintest whisper. "Thank you." The storm howled outside, but within these four walls, a new warmth lived. And Garrett, eyes finally closing, knew the fight was not over, but death had lost this battle. And as the darkness finally claimed him, what would greet him when he awoke would change everything he believed about the wild, about survival, and about the sacred bond between man and beast. The world returned in fragments, cold air burning against cracked lips, the muffled groan of a wind-battered roof, and the faint, rhythmic thump of a distant heartbeat. Garrett Monroe's consciousness floated between the shadowed edge of death and the cruel, raw persistence of life. A cough racked his body, sharp and tearing, as he drew in a gasp of air that tasted of ice, wood, and something else. Fur, earth breath. His eyelids, crusted with frost, peeled open, and the world sharpened into focus through a hazy, fractured lens. The room, the ranger station, stood around him like the bones of a long-forgotten refuge. Walls cracked with age, windows coated in ice, and the floor beneath him frozen solid. The air hung with the metallic bite of cold and the charred scent of spent flare powder. But what stopped his broken heart from giving incompletely was the sight inches from his face. The cubs, alive, their tiny bodies, no longer stiff and silent, rose and fell with each fragile breath. Their fur, once crusted with death's frost, now glistened with the damp of warmth returning, steam rising faintly from their forms. And above them, a massive, towering figure, the bear, the male, colossal and primal, the embodiment of the wild's raw and unyielding power. His massive frame, thick with ice and scarred by battles with winter and time, curved protectively around the cubs. His breath, hot and steady, rolled from his nostrils in rhythmic puffs that warmed the air around the fragile creatures. The bear's eyes, black, deep, and ancient, flicked to Garrett. And Garrett, raw, broken, felt the weight of that gaze. It was not the gaze of predator to prey. It was something older, something beyond language, beyond fear. A question. Garrett's chest, though racked with agony, heaved with a rasped whisper. You kept them alive." His voice, no louder than a breath, cracked in the frozen air. The bear's ears flicked at the sound, his gray head lowering slightly. Steam coiled from his maw, as if in reply, though no sound passed his lips. Garrett's body screamed, every nerve an open wound, every joint stiff and unyielding. But his hand moved, slow, trembling, barely more than a twitch, toward the cubs. The bear shifted. A low, deep rumble rolled through the beast's chest, a sound not of threat, but of warning. Not against harm, but against carelessness, against moving too fast, too soon. Garrett's hand stilled. His cracked lips parted again, his voice a fragile, rasped plea. "Let me help them." The bear, massive, powerful, and unknowable, hesitated. And in that heartbeat, the room changed. It was no longer a shelter or a battleground. It became something sacred, an altar where trust, raw and fragile, was being forged. The bear's nostrils flared, his breath misting over Garrett's trembling hand. And then he moved, not back, aside, a fraction, but it was enough. Garrett's heart, splintered and barely beating, cracked further, not from pain, but from the weight of what had just been given. Permission. His hand, blue and shaking, found the smallest cub. The warmth beneath his fingers was fragile, but real. He pressed 2 fingers gently beneath its tiny chin, searching, asterisk yes there, asterisk a pulse. Weak, fluttering, but fighting. The second cub, a shallow, tremoring breath, but breathing. A broken, choked sound escaped Garrett, half sob, half prayer. His body, beyond its limit, threatened to collapse, but his heart, would not. His voice, wrecked and raw, rasped, "Stay with me, little ones. We're not done. We're—" A sudden cough from the smaller cub, wet and sharp. Too cold, too soon. Their fragile bodies, still on the knife's edge, needed more heat. Garrett's gaze snapped upward to the bear, his voice, desperate, pleading, tore from his chest. "They'll die," he choked, his body lurching in agony as he forced the words. Without a gasp, more heat. The bear, mighty and massive, moved again, not away, closer. Garrett's broken breath hitched as the colossal beast lowered his entire bulk, great paws shifting, his frame folding down around them all. The earth trembled with the bear's massive weight. The room, cold and lifeless, suddenly changed. The bear's colossal form became a wall, a fortress, a womb of warmth. His body, thick with fur and heaving with life, caged them all from the storm outside. Garrett, his body crushed against the frozen floor, felt the sudden shift. The air warmer, the floor less biting. His trembling hands pressed to the cubs' tiny chests, felt it, a faint flutter, their hearts growing steadier. A sob, raw and cracked, broke from Garrett's throat. His forehead, slick with cold sweat and blood, fell against the earth, and his voice, half whisper, half prayer, escaped. You're saving them." The bear, his massive sides rising and falling in deep, steady breaths, made no reply, no sound, but his body spoke. "We save them. Together." Garrett's heart, splintered and stitched with agony, clenched around a truth too immense to hold. This creature, the terror of the wild, was not his enemy. He was their ally. The 3 of them, man, beast, and the fragile thread of life between them, formed something ancient, something that transcended words or reason. Garrett's body, shattered, burning, finally gave. His strength, spent, collapsed, and the darkness surged. But this time, he did not fall alone. The heat, the heartbeat, of the great bear at his side held him. And as the shadows swallowed his vision, the last sound he heard was the soft, steady breathing of 2 tiny, living cubs. But Garrett's battle was far from over, because when the dawn came, the world would finally come looking for them. The silence that greeted Garrett Monroe upon waking was the heaviest he had ever known. An absence of sound so profound it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. His eyes, heavy and swollen, cracked open to a dim haze. The room was steeped in shadows, lit only by the dull, blue-gray light that seeped through the frost-choked windows. The air tasted of earth and fur, of old wood and dying cold. His body, broken, bruised, and barely his own, was pinned between agony and something warm. A warmth that pulsed, alive and steady, against his side. Slowly, with a tremor that rattled through every shattered nerve, Garrett turned his head. The bear was still there. The massive creature, a titan of the wilderness, lay curled around the cubs, his colossal frame curved like an unbreakable wall. His breath, slow and rhythmic, steamed faintly in the cold air. His body, scarred and ancient, radiated a heat that defied the storm outside, a warmth that had, against all odds, kept them alive. The cubs. Garrett's heart lurched. His gaze snapped downward, and his throat closed on a gasp. They were moving. Two tiny forms, once frozen and still, now nestled deep against the bear's side, their fur damp from melting frost. One gave a soft, trembling cough, and the sound, so fragile, so alive, crushed something deep inside Garrett's chest. His vision blurred, his breath hitching painfully as he swallowed against the raw, jagged sob clawing up his throat. A sound, low rumbling, vibrated through the floorboards. Garrett's gaze lifted, and he met the bear's eyes. The great beast was watching him. Those eyes, black and deep as winter's night, held him captive. But there was no threat in them, no wild fury. What met Garrett's shattered gaze was something older than instinct, something primal and shared, a knowing. Garrett's lips parted, his voice raw and threadbare. You stayed." The bear's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but his great body remained still, a monument of muscle and heat, shelter. Garrett's chest ached as he spoke again, his voice splintering with the weight of every inch they had crawled through hell together. "You saved them." His lips cracked on the words, but he forced them out. "You saved us." His throat burned as something inside him broke loose, an emotion so raw and untamed it felt like it had always lived beneath his skin. His voice cracked into the frozen air, trembling and real. "Why?" The bear did not answer, at least not with sound. Instead, he moved. The massive head, crowned with frost and time, lowered, slowly, deliberately, until the broad, scarred bridge of his muzzle pressed gently against Garrett's chest. The warmth of his breath seeped into Garrett's ribs, and in that sacred, fragile contact, something passed between them. It wasn't language. It was older. It was grief. It was loss. It was the cry of something that knew what it meant to feel the hollow agony of life slipping away, to fight for it, to fail, and to try again. Garrett's throat closed with the weight of it, his heart breaking in a way no wound had ever managed. His fingers, raw and torn, moved, and without knowing why, without thinking, he touched the bear. His palm, trembling and blood-crusted, pressed into the coarse, matted fur between the bear's eyes. And in that moment, man and beast, predator and prey, became something else. Garrett felt it, everything. A flash, shattered and raw, of a den, of warmth and breath and tiny heartbeats, of his mate, her fur pressed close, her body curled around life. The sanctuary, a family, then thunder, the crash of something too human, too cruel, the shattering of stone, the shriek of metal, smoke and fire, and a howl that tore through the sky and shattered something inside. The cold, the loss, and the unbearable, endless search. Garrett's breath was ripped from his lungs as the echo of the bear's grief slammed into him. His chest collapsed under it, a sob wrenched free from the deepest place inside him, because he knew this agony. He knew what it meant to lose something that was a part of your soul. His voice, broken and trembling, escaped without his consent. You lost them. The bear's eyes, those ancient, shattered eyes, closed. Garrett's chest cracked wide open, and the sob he could no longer hold escaped, raw and racked with a sorrow that was no longer his alone. I'm so. His voice splintered, breaking on the words. I'm so sorry. The bear didn't move, didn't growl, didn't flee. He simply stayed. In that silence, something shifted. The walls between man and beast, between instinct and understanding, crumbled. And for the first time, Garrett understood. The bear had saved the cubs because they were all he had left. The bear had saved Garrett because he knew. Because no one should face death alone. Garrett's fingers, weak and trembling, curled deeper into the bear's fur. His voice, ragged and small, rasped, I'll keep them safe. His lips cracked on the vow. I swear to you, I'll keep them safe. The bear's body, massive and battle-worn, exhaled a breath that felt like the breaking of a dam. Not submission, not dominance, but trust. A bond, raw, unspoken, and unbreakable, was sealed in the hollow between their heartbeats. The wind outside howled like a dying god, rattling the bones of the old station. But within those walls, a warmth remained. The bear, his massive frame still curved protectively around the cubs, lowered his head beside Garrett's. His breath was steady, a heartbeat of the wild, alive. Garrett, his body broken and spent, felt his eyes close. But this time, he did not fear the darkness, because he was not alone. But as dawn's first light cracked against the frozen windows, the sound of engines shattered the silence. And something far colder than the storm was finally coming for them. The first sound to break the fragile peace was a low, mechanical growl. Not the voice of the earth or sky, not the breath of the beast at his side. This was something unnatural, cold, and hungry. Garrett Monroe's eyes snapped open, the pain in his body instant and blinding. But his instincts, those primal, ancient instincts, roared louder. His pulse thundered as he turned his head toward the sound. Through the frost-coated window, barely visible beyond the veil of morning fog and thinning snow, headlights. His breath caught, and for a fleeting moment, something wild and desperate sparked in his chest. Rescue. But the spark died almost as quickly as it came, because he knew that salvation never sounded like a predator stalking its prey. The bear knew it too. The colossal beast, his protector, his ally, stiffened, his body shifting from warmth and shelter to readiness. His massive head lifted, ears pricked forward, his breath slow and measured. A low, guttural rumble rolled from deep within his chest, a sound that needed no translation. Danger. Garrett's heart pounded against his bruised ribs, and his shattered voice rasped, No. His cracked lips bled as he spoke. No, stay back. The bear's dark eyes flicked to him, and then to the cubs. The smallest of them stirred, their tiny forms huddled against Garrett's side, their breath shallow but alive. And in that instant, Garrett felt the bear's choice, the same choice he himself had made when he had thrown his body between them and the storm. To protect, to fight, to die, if that was what it cost. The engines outside surged louder, their growl turning into a feral roar. Then came the metallic clatter of doors swinging open, boots crunching on snow, and voices. They're in there. Thermal scan confirms, large heat signature, adult bear, and multiple smaller signatures. A pause, then a new voice, cold and hard, cut through the air. Take it down. Garrett's veins ignited with terror. His broken body, driven by something deeper than pain, moved. No. His voice, ragged, raw, and torn, exploded from his chest. His palms slapped against the frozen wood as he dragged himself up, his ribs screaming with every inch. Don't. But the answer came in thunder. A crack. The window beside him shattered as a dart, sleek and cold, whipped past his face and buried into the bear's flank. The beast's roar split the air, pure agony and betrayal, his massive form lurching backward, claws raking the floor, splintering wood. His eyes, wide and burning with confusion, found Garrett's. And Garrett's heart broke, because in that gaze he saw the question, why? And Garrett, his voice splintering, cried out, "No, no, they're here to kill you." But the bear's legs, colossal and unbreakable, shook. His body, made of mountains and storms, began to fall. The second shot, Garrett saw it, and moved. A scream ripped from his throat as he threw himself between the barrel and the beast. The dart, cold and merciless, slammed into his shoulder. The burn was instant, fire searing through his veins. His vision twisted, the world bending sideways. But his body, in its final act of defiance, covered the bear. His voice, slurred and broken, rasped into the fur beneath him. "You don't die here. You don't die." The bear's labored breath warmed his cheek. And, against every law of nature, Garrett felt it. The beast, who had every reason to flee, stayed. A shadow fell across them. Boots. The glint of a rifle barrel. "Step aside, sir." Garrett's voice, weak, cracked, broke through clenched teeth. "No." The barrel didn't waver. "This isn't your fight." Garrett's chest heaved, his body screaming with the sedative's venom, but his voice, raw, defiant, answered, "It is now." The gun's safety clicked, but so did something else. A sound, deep, primordial. The bear's growl, changing, no longer wounded, no longer confused, now angry. The earth shook. The bear, his body colossal and battle-worn, rose. The dart had slowed him, but not stopped him. A wall of fur and fury erupted upward, and the hunter's command twisted into a scream as the bear's roar, a sound that belonged to mountains and gods, shattered the sky. The rifle swung, but a blur of motion, and teeth met steel. The weapon, crushed. The hunter, thrown. But more shadows advanced. Red dots, laser sights, found the bear's heart. Garrett, his body failing, his vision collapsing, moved again. His voice, wrecked and ruined, exploded. "Stop." The sound froze them, not because it was loud, but because it was human, and it was breaking. Garrett's knees hit the floor, his body, empty, drained, collapsed between predator and men. His arms, barely his own, spread wide, his chest heaving. And through his shattering voice, raw, ruined, and filled with something they could not ignore, he begged, Don't you see?" His voice, a sob and a scream, cracked like breaking glass. He saved us. His throat closed, but he fought. He chose to stay, to save them. His body trembled, but he, who had nothing left, stood in front of death itself. "You're aiming at the wrong enemy." The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and waiting. The bear, towering, breathing, bleeding, stood behind him, but did not kill, did not charge, did not run. He waited, with Garrett. And in that impossible silence, a single voice, from the armed line, cracked, uncertain, "Sir." The barrel wavered. A command, cold and sure, barked back, "Take the shot." But a finger did not squeeze. Instead, a whisper, fractured, from behind scope. "Is he protecting them?" The wind howled. The bear breathed. Garrett's voice, a whisper from the edge of death, barely more than a heartbeat, rasped, "Yes." But the choice was not yet made, because the one holding the rifle was still deciding. The air was thick with the cold bite of the wilderness and the crackling tension of a decision not yet made. Garrett Monroe felt every fiber of his broken body straining to remain upright, his legs trembling beneath the unbearable weight of exhaustion and agony. His breath, raw and labored, escaped in shallow bursts that barely formed clouds in the freezing air. His torn jacket clung to him, soaked with blood and sweat, but his body was nothing more than a vessel for his will, a shield between death and the creature behind him. The bear, his colossal form battered and bleeding, stood motionless, his breath heavy, eyes locked not on the soldiers but on Garrett. And between them all, the cubs, so small, so impossibly fragile, pressed against the earth, their sides rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of survival's thin thread. The line of soldiers, faceless behind their scopes and visors, stood poised, fingers tight on triggers, the tension of the moment stretched so thin that the air itself seemed to vibrate with the choice that had not yet fallen. Garrett's voice, shredded and failing, tore from his throat. "You're pointing your guns at the wrong one." His eyes, wild and burning with something beyond pain, found the nearest figure, the one with the rifle steady on the bear's heart. "He saved us. His chest hitched, the cold stabbing every rib. He's not the enemy." His knees threatened to give, but he locked them, his body trembling with the last dregs of his defiance. "I won't let you kill him." A voice, sharp and cold from behind the barrels, snapped back. "Stand down. That bear is a Class 1 threat." Garrett's broken laugh cracked into the air. "Threat." He spat blood onto the snow, his voice trembling but unshaken. "He's the only reason I'm still alive. The only reason they," his arm, weak but unshaking, pointed to the cubs, "are still alive." His voice cracked, his soul in every word. "If you shoot him, you're killing the only good left in this goddamn storm." A new voice, colder and laced with finality, cut through the air. "Move, or you die with it." Garrett's body, torn, spent, straightened, and his answer, broken and absolute, was carved into the air. "Then shoot." His lips, cracked and bleeding, barely moved, but his voice, hoarse and defiant, burned through the frozen wind. "But you'll have to kill me first." The silence that followed was a living thing, an eternity carved into seconds. The rifleman's finger trembled on the trigger. A heartbeat passed, then another. A single gunshot, but not from the line. The crack split the air from somewhere behind, above, and a howl of pain. Human. The commanding voice, cut off, replaced by a scream. The soldiers turned. A form, one of their own, down, his body writhing, his weapon fallen. A shot from an unseen rifle, distant from the tree lean. Then, another crack, this one hitting a nearby tree trunk, splintering bark. Chaos ignited like wildfire. "Sniper," a voice bellowed. "Get to cover." The line of soldiers broke, splintering into confusion, their muzzles swinging from the bear to the unseen threat beyond the tree line. But Garrett, his body barely holding, did not move. His back remained a wall between the rifles and the bear. His body, shaking, was a vow made of flesh and blood. And the bear stayed, not fleeing, not attacking, only waiting. His sides heaved with the labor of his wounds, but his gaze never left Garrett. And in those eyes, Garrett saw it. The bear wasn't staying to fight. He was staying because Garrett had stayed. The chaos crashed around them. Orders screamed, boots crunching snow, radios cracking with frantic voices. "Who the hell is firing on us?" "Unknown marksman, Squad 4 flank north." But the bear did not run, and Garrett, his body a ruin, did not fall. A sudden, thunderous roar of engines, new, from behind, and the shatter of a helicopter's spotlight carved a beam through the haze, blinding white over the snow. The searchlight locked on them. Garrett, the bear, the cubs, a tableau of man and beast against the chaos. A voice, cold and mechanical, boomed from the speaker. "Hold your fire." The soldiers, frozen mid-chaos, hesitated, the command slashing through their adrenaline. "Identify yourself." A soldier barked toward the chopper. The voice, female, clipped commanding, answered. "Dr. Evelyn Rourke, Wildlife Conservation Agency. This bear is under federal protection. Stand your ground, no engagement." The commander, half shielded behind a tree, barked into his radio. "This is a classified operation. Who the hell authorized you?" The helicopter's spotlight burned down. "I did." And Garrett, his body collapsing to his knees, his heart barely beating, saw her, a figure descending from the helicopter's ladder, her face carved with cold resolve. Dr. Evelyn Rourke, graying, sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting battles no one saw. Her boots hit the snow, and her voice, clear and carved from iron, rang out. "Stand down your weapons. That bear is the only reason he's alive." The commander's voice, furious and cracking, roared back, "This thing killed our men." "No," Rourke's voice sliced through him. "Your orders killed your men." Her arm shot forward, pointing. "Because you saw threat." Her finger turned, and she pointed at Garrett, broken and bleeding, saw life worth saving. The soldiers, rifles trembling, hesitated. Garrett's voice, a ruin, rose. "He saved me," he rasped, his words fractured and bleeding, but they hit the air like iron. "He chose to save us. I stood between him and death." His voice cracked, and he chose mercy. His head lifted, his shattered gaze meeting every rifle scope. "So if you shoot him," his voice raw and final, "then you're killing mercy itself." A silence so absolute it felt like the world itself waited. The rifles lowered. A tremor shook Garrett's chest, half a sob, half disbelief. His body, spent beyond repair, began to fall. But the bear moved. With a strength as ancient as the earth, the beast, towering, bleeding, caught him. The massive head, rough with ice and fur, pressed into Garrett's chest, holding him, keeping him from hitting the ground. And Garrett, his broken fingers, curled into that fur, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." The soldiers stood, silent witnesses, to something they would never be able to name. The helicopter's rotor cut the air, and Dr. Rourke's voice, soft and edged with something human, called, "We've got you. Let's get them both out of here." 2 weeks later, the news footage circled the world. A man, battered, broken, shielding a bear. A bear, ancient, towering, sheltering a man. But it wasn't the footage that made the world stop. It was the eyes, man and beast, looking at each other and seeing something the world had long forgotten. That survival is not conquest. It is connection. Garrett Monroe never returned to the wilderness. But every spring, he returned to the edge of it. And sometimes, just before the trees swallowed the horizon, a shadow, massive, knowing, stood. They never touched, never approached, but they saw. And that was enough.